For 4 decades of ups and downs between what are now the world's two biggest economies. Joseph Pelzman, Professor of Economics and International Affairs and Law at George Washington University, is in studio now to discuss some of these key issues. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So let's start with some perspective here. Given where China and the US's economies were back in 1979, what do you think have been the most distinctive markers of this bilateral relationship?
Well, I mean, '79 was an epic moment because it opened up the market for the Chinese in the United States as well as Europe, and so that triggered this enormous incentive to invest inside China, altered the country substantially. But the big events occurred much later in the '90s. But market access was the key, and that's where we're full circle now, except we're not dealing about market access in terms of the U.S. market or the European market. We're dealing with questions about market access in the Chinese market. And so the trigger that started this process in '79 was most favored nation status. That paid off really well. A lot of businessmen came to China, started the process of local industrialization. So it all worked well. What I call in my text, state-supervised capitalism worked well for 40 years. And now we're in sort of a marked moment where we have a White House that looks at the regime and says, well, state-supervised capitalism isn't really not a market economy, it's interventionist. And so that becomes a stumbling block 40 years later.
Now, it's interesting. You mentioned this turning point in the relationship. Just how significant is this current particular moment in time between these two nations?
It's very significant because China is no longer, a third world country. It's not '79. It's 40 years later. It's a major power economically as well as others areas. So it's a major player. It's no longer, a third world country. And its economic system has more government controls, interference, sort of interventions, if you like, than this administration is comfortable with. And it would like access to the Chinese market, where we already have lots of joint ventures operating in China. And so the stumbling block is, well, how much are you going to give to become more transparent in terms of market economics? And will you get rid of performance requirements? Because the big deal in most of these disputes is performance requirements. They can call it, intrusion. They can talk about intellectual property rights. But basically, it's about performance requirements of a foreign firm coming into China. And that is common when we're dealing with countries. And for example, you can see it statewide in terms of the United States, where a large corporation comes to New York and wants to know, how much am I going to get paid in order to move my resources into your state? Right. Well, the same thing happens across countries. Countries invite investors in, and then they expect certain performances.
Now, we do know that obviously one of the sticking points, at least from the US side, is about the pace of reforms.
Correct.
But given the size and the scope of an economy as big as China's and the sort of pace of development that they've had over the past 40 years, what should people really understand about how this has been working between the US and China?
Somehow someone in this administration forgot what happened between '79 and 40 years later. In other words, if you look at the pace of change of China in '79 to today, it's enormous. It took countries hundreds of years to do this. So realizing that, the fact that there was this huge jump that was done already in 40 years and magnificently successful, now the trick is, how do I get one step further, which is, get rid of performance requirements. And so the debate is, well, can you do it in a year? Well, you're not going to be able to do it in a year. You can do it in a number of years. You can do it sector specific, because you're not going to open up every sector at the same time. But it's in both countries' interests, because if we look at the data in terms of automobile, just as one of the sectors, at some point, China is going to wind up exporting automobiles to the United States, which will be great because it will be cheaper than what's coming on from Japan. But the idea is, in order to access that market, they have to open up their side of the market. So this entire debate, although it's couched in terms of trade wars and tariffs, that's just a facade. It's not really about tariffs. It's about market access and performance requirements for foreign investors from the United States and Europe who come into China. And so that's what the name of the game in this dispute. Right. And that takes a while to get rid of in terms of restrictiveness. But if it moves in the right directions, we have a joke, you know, the first derivative and second derivative. You know, how quickly am I moving, and am I moving in the right direction?
I do want to get to the future of this relationship. We don't have a whole lot of time. What are some of the sectors and the issues that you think are going to dominate the start of the next 40 years of this U.S.-China relationship?
It's basically going to be about sort of competition policy. In other words, the whole point of market access that's unhindered, without performance requirements, is really a discussion about, well, what kind of industrial structure are you going to have? And is it going to look more like me, that is the United States, or is it going to look more like you, with state-supervised authorities sort of saying, well, you should go here, you should go there? In other words, there are people in the United States who are grappling with this idea that Beijing says, well, this year we're going to have 1 million new cars and they're all going to be electric. And next year we're going to have another million. So the White House doesn't do that. It doesn't really go out there and say, oh, we should do the following, because that's not the brainwave here. So that's the real challenge of how do I get there? And there is, unfortunately, a case at the WTO between the Europeans and China about whether or not China is a market economy or not. And so we're grappling with the question of how do I define a market economy?
Right.
China is grappling with the same question. What rules do I have to get rid of in order to be considered, quote unquote, a market economy? So that's the debate.
Certainly something that comes with increased development of any nation.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. Great talking to you, though.
Thank you.
Joseph Pelzman there, Professor of Economics and International Affairs and Law at George Washington University.